My name is John Lumley, and I'm going to I am not now, nor have I ever been, associated with the English National Health Service, according to the proceedings. I actually am with the University of Nottingham, and formerly with HP Labs in Bristol. This penultimate session is about adaptation of content and layout, and we have 3 long papers, full papers. The first of which is basically from Australians with American attachment, I believe, and Keith Vander Linden is going to be talking to the title that's up there.
Good afternoon. My name is Keith Vander Linden. I'll be talking about work that I've done with my colleagues Nathalie, Colineau, and Cecile, both at CSIRO in Sydney, Australia, in collaboration with Centrelink, which is Australia's delivery organization for health and human services. The project in general involves the tailoring of content, which distinguishes our work perhaps from the papers after us, which deal more with the tailoring of layout. And in particular today I'll be talking about the representation and expression of conditions, which is quite important in public administration. I'll start with an example to give you a sense of what we're doing here. I give you here a 3-page excerpt from Centrelink's informational brochure for their AB study program. I won't go through the details, simply to say that this is an entitlement program for Indigenous Australians going back to school. What we're more interested in is the second 2 pages of this excerpt, the eligibility conditions. These conditions figure large in public administrative texts. Here, for example, we see all the requirements that are placed upon the AB study program. So, for example, to be eligible for this program, you must be an Aboriginal Australian, or you must be Aboriginal. I found this definition exceedingly interesting. Not only, it's a 3-part definition, in fact. Not only do you have to be an Australian, Indigenous Australian, but you also have to identify yourself as such and be identified by others as such. A fairly complicated definition. You can probably imagine political and social wrangling over the decades to produce this particular text. It props up in Centrelink's documentation over and over again, pretty much word for word, because it is a quasi-legal statement. All right? In addition to that, you must also be an Australian citizen, as you might imagine, and you must be studying some approved course or undertaking an approved apprenticeship. As you can see from this example, these are generic brochures. They're designed for just about anyone. Any one of us could read this and decide whether we're eligible for this program. And for most of us, the answer is probably no. We probably fail on all 3 counts. All right? Centrelink's challenge to CSIRO, my colleagues and I, was to help them explore the possibility of tailoring these brochures. Instead of a generic audience, we wanted to focus on a particular individual. All right? With that, the talk will generally go along 4 lines. I'll talk about the tailoring, in particular in the context of a demo. I'll quickly demo the system that I have running on my local server. Then we'll talk about the system that underlies it and focus on the conditions. So I'll start off with this demo, which I will dig up right. Oops, that's not the demo. There's the demo. The beginning of a tailoring demo always asks for questions from the user. We need to know something about our reader before we can tailor for them. This particular list of questions is automatically generated by our system based upon the underlying model. It looks through all of the conditions relevant to the programs it knows about and collects those things and produces a query wizard that you see here. The mechanism for doing that production is something that we'll talk about. If I, as the reader, choose not to specify anything and ask the system to grab eligible programs or programs for which I might potentially be eligible, it will go off and it will give a list of all the programs that we currently have in our knowledge base, which in this case is 3 programs, the 3 student-oriented programs from Centrelink. The first is the AB study program that we just talked about. The second is AU study. This is for non-traditional older students. I had actually a chance of getting AU study had I been a resident long enough. I had no chance at youth allowance because I'm not youthful enough. You have to be under 25 to get that. If I were to look then at the AB study brochure, that's automatically produced and tailored for this nobody that's produced no useful information on the input, I get pretty much the same brochure that I showed you earlier. I've formatted it here in terms of a web page, similar to the way Centrelink formats their web page right now. And if I ask for eligibility information, it will tell me exactly what you saw before, that I have to be an Indigenous Australian. Here's that three-part definition again, exactly copied, citizenship, and the course and apprenticeship. So that's pretty much the same. If, on the other hand, I rerun this scenario and I take on a persona, which is not me, by the way, but a 21-year-old, let's see if I get my paper out of the way here, Australian, Indigenous, Australian Aboriginal, planning to take an approved course. If I give just that bits of information, that's enough, as we know, to establish me as being eligible for this program. I can ask for the programs for which I'm potentially eligible again, and this time I'm going to get a shorter list. I've lost my chance for AU study because that's for older students, and I'm only 21. I still get the AB study program and the youth allowance. Our system actually knows enough about the potential rates of funding that you might get that it could suggest one or the other. Centrelink was not interested in having us make those value judgments, so we just give you the ones that you're potentially eligible for. I happen to know that in my circumstance I would prefer to go with AB study. There's more money available for me there. If I look this time, I see the same definition of the AB study program in the web form, just like we saw before, but now the eligibility is considerably simpler. It knows a lot about me now. It knows, well, it just comes right out and says now that the tailored form, you've told us that you meet the following criteria. You are an Indigenous Australian, you are an Australian citizen, and you are undertaking an approved course or an Australian apprenticeship. So you should be eligible for this program. If I'm in doubt as to what these definitions mean, we do continue to include details links so you can still get that famous three-part definition of an Indigenous Australian. Now, what I'd like to focus on in this talk is the conditions. So you've seen several expressions of the conditions in these documents now. And in our informal study, we discovered that roughly 50% of these brochures is filled with conditions, definitions of terms involving conditions, and so forth, like this text here, for example. So we're quite interested in coming up with some mechanism for dealing with that. You'll see the first form here is an obligatory form. You must be an Indigenous Australian. That's one form that we've seen, and then it goes on to give the definition. On the previous page, you've seen the short feedback statement. You are an Indigenous Australian, similar but not the same, all coming from the underlying knowledge base. And there was a third expression of this that may be less obvious than the first two. That was on the very first page, the query wizard itself, which is automatically generated. Are you an Indigenous Australian? Again, a fairly related form, but different and used in context. Okay, and so those are the three basic forms that our system is producing at the current moment for conditions: the obligatory, the declarative, and the query. And you can see on this first page that the query form actually comes in several guises depending upon the sort of condition that we're talking about. If we're talking about the Indigenous Australian, the system actually, in fact, represents other races as well, but this is the only race that really matters. So getting back to an earlier talk where you could be female or other, here you can be Indigenous Australian or other, okay, because anything apart from Indigenous Australian leads to no special distinguishing marks. All right. On the other hand, if the various values of the form do play a role, so for example, what is my school status, for example, full-time, part-time, not a student, any one of those can lead to different payment rates, so the system produces a multiple choice question in that context. And as a simplification at the moment, whenever we ask for integer input, we're just asking for the actual value. So those are three query forms that will come up depending upon the nature of the question. If I had specified all the information here and I quantify the final documents, on average they're roughly 40% shorter than Centrelink's current originals. So what I will do now is get back to the talk itself. Talk a little bit about the underlying system that's implementing all of this. The system comprises two basic components: a document generator and a context model. I'll say a little bit about the document generator and a little bit more about the context model. The document generator is based upon a top-down hierarchical planner that's been common in AI for many, many years. It's configured with declarative plan operators that are specifically set up to build a discourse tree that's rhetorically annotated. Okay, so that's a discourse planning technology directly out of the natural language generation community, from whence we hail, incidentally. The generation itself, the construction of the actual text on the page, is coarse-grained. That is, we're working with larger chunks of text on the order of paragraphs or sections, like the Indigenous Australian definition. Not only is it an engineering problem that makes it a little easier and more efficient to construct these texts, but also we have these blocks of text that we don't want to mess with. I have much respect for the summarization folks in the previous session, but we didn't want to try to paraphrase or summarize this three-part definition of Australian Indigenous. So that's how we chose the coarse-grained generation, departing from our roots in language generation. The mechanism that we're using, therefore, lies somewhere on a continuum between the full natural language generation on the one hand and more commercial document automation systems on the other. The discourse planning comes out of NLG, and the coarse-grained generation is much more like document automation. We're probably much closer to the DA side of that spectrum. The major difference is that we retain that discourse tree with the rhetorical annotations. That's helpful to us in generating the feedback expression that I showed you earlier. You've told us that, ... It also has been useful to us in other work on layout, which we also are interested in. The context model itself is implemented in LDL, and it is what retains all of the conditions and all of the blocks of text. We implement reasoning using Hermit, which is a fairly standard approach. The reasoning is used in two ways. It helps us decide who's eligible for what, and it also helps us decide who needs to hear what. So we decide what elements of the text to include and how to format the text based upon some of the reasoning as well. It's probably easier to explain this thing in the context of another short demo which I will run, in which I show you the beginnings of what might be called an authoring tool. I think that probably does it too much of a service. It's right now an implementation tool that we hope to improve and make it actually author-friendly. At the moment, it's a bit author-surly, but at least it will show us the contents of the knowledge base, which is a standard OWL knowledge base, so there's not much here that would surprise anyone familiar with semantic web technologies. We've got awards. Centrelink has lots of those, benefits, claim methods, lots of conditions. Program, there are those three programs that we currently implement. The individual for A/B study looks as follows, and here's where you're going to see those blocks of text that the author has written. So the expectation is that the author will write these things and do what they do best. Then we will clump them together sort of as a Lego generation, if you will. You'll see that we have a space for the author to specify the precise title. Centrelink inexplicably capitalizes A/B study, or it uppercases A/B study and only capitalizes AU study. I've never understood that, and I'm not sure they do either. The short description is here, again, handwritten, not an automatic summary, and then the full description. You can see that these are set up for templates. There are little escape sequences in here that allow me to grab text from other parts of the knowledge base, and they're all formatted in HTML. For us, perhaps the more interesting part is the aggregation. We can see a number of other individuals that are related to this one. The one that we most care about is the conditions. We've talked about the aboriginality condition already. There's the individual that underlies that. And here you can see the OWL syntax. This is Manchester OWL syntax. For those of you that are familiar, you must have the race value of Indigenous Australian. We also have the citizenship condition. That's similar to the aboriginality. We actually specify that you have to be a person. The discourse plans are set up so that we don't actually come out and say that. It seems insulting to tell a person that they must be human. But Centrelink, in fact, does give benefit to other things besides people, to organizations and schools and so forth. So it is a condition that underlies the system. The discourse planner is the one that's deciding to suppress that hidden information. Also, we have the approved course in Australian apprenticeship. That's ORD, so you can see the standard disjunction here. Now, what we wanted to set up was a system that allowed the authors to author things, but that we would try to step in and do some generation of things that were rather more mundane. Now, this, for example, is a disjunction. You have to be an apprentice or studying an approved course. We allowed the authors to step in and write this out, and in fact, the authors can produce a better version than we can with our fairly simple mechanism for doing ontology verbalization. We can do disjunctions and conjunctions, and they're logically correct, but as it gets more complicated, they become harder and harder to understand. The assumption was that the author would step in quickly, say, everybody out of the pool, I'm just going to write this one, rather than have it automatically generated. And here you can see this is where they've done that. Mostly for this, I've just been cutting and pasting the text directly out of the current brochures. All right? The Aboriginality condition, on the other hand, is one where we let the system go it on its own. There's no description listed down below, and here we see the condition that we're going to be verbalizing. And in the computational linguistics world, this problem is commonly called ontology verbalization. All right? Now, I think that's probably easier to show you with my slides. So, oops, that was my slides there. So I'll go back there, and I'll say this little bit about the conditions. Here's that Aboriginality condition again, just on the slide. You'll remember that it didn't have a name, a short or a long description. That's because the author is leaving it to the system. But it does have the logical condition. Now, we construct the expression of these forms using the following approach, and these are all implemented in the declarative plan operators. These can be changed, but this is what we have now. The name of the condition, if it were to be a title of a section, picks up the name of the relationship, race. The short description starts with just a simple introductory text, you must be, you are, fairly simple chunking together of text, you must be an Indigenous Australian. The long description takes the short description, you must be an Indigenous Australian, and tacks on the an Indigenous Australian is someone who ... All right, so it's a fairly simple mechanism. So you can see some issues here that we do have to deal with. First of all, it's a limited range of forms that we're producing, but our hope and our expectation is that in a public administrative text, these things are relatively constrained, so that we don't need a broad range of expression. A second issue that we need to deal with is the expressiveness. We're not doing full ontology verbalization, so we can handle attributions such as this one. So you have a race, Aboriginal, have citizenship, this, and so forth. We can handle instantiations. You must be a person. And we can handle disjunction and conjunction, as I said before, in a fairly limited way. But we will have to be careful when we build the authoring tool that the forms of conditions we allow the author to specify will also be ones that we can generate. All right? The system also takes care of, at this point, age ranges and the like, between 21 and 25, under 16, and so forth. Some other limitations on this thing where it's going to be a challenge, I think, when we start building the interface to make it so that the author understands the ramifications of what they do. You can see here, for example, that this long description of the race relationship really isn't a long description at all. The text plan operators never present that as a description of the relationship. In fact, we never describe the relationship at all. But the author needs to understand the changes to that will have ramifications throughout the document. They may be trying to fiddle with the query form, the query wizard, but they'll be changing things down in the definition deep down inside the document as well. So we're hoping to give some mechanism to the author to see the ramifications of the changes that they're making, but that will be a challenge. And in addition, there are some repairs that need to be done. So this indefinite article, for example, sometimes is a, sometimes it's an. So we have very simple textual replacements that handle those repairs. And that also is limited. So we need to make sure that we have a range of vocabulary that would be appropriate for people, authors using this system. And we need to make sure that they will understand all of that. Okay. So I'm moving up here to the conclusions. We believe that we've demonstrated at least the promise of some useful capability for producing public administrative texts. We took the original documents that Centrelink gave us, which were roughly 50% comprised of conditions and eligibility discussions. And we reduced the size of those things by 40% by providing a query wizard that we collected information from users and then producing a simplified text. The documents that we produced were not simply going through the document and cutting out bits of blocks of text, although we did definitely do that. So if, for example, we found out that the person was an Aboriginal, we didn't waste their time or ours defining what an Aboriginal was to this person. But we also included additional text that wasn't in the original brochures. So we provided feedback text and other forms of personalization. We said things like, "You have told us that, ... This discussion of tailoring is relatively rare in the public administrative domain. I was actually quite surprised by that, but it's a very common topic of conversation in e-health. So we took a lot of our marching orders from this work from e-health. So we produced the sorts of feedback that they often do in e-health. We produced personalizations at the very beginning of the document. I didn't show you, but the system will say, "We've tailored this just for you, Joe Blow, on such and such a date." The e-health community discovers that all you really need to do is put that sentence at the beginning of the otherwise unchanged documents, and people will tend to it more carefully. Not surprisingly, they call that placebo tailoring in that domain. We will try to take advantage of the same thing, but there is a large question as to whether the tailoring forms that are used in e-health will also be appropriate in other domains like public administration. The work in progress I've alluded to a couple of times. We are attempting to do the evaluation of the effectiveness of the tailored texts. We have one qualitative evaluation under our belt. Once we produced this system, which was sometime last spring, Centrelink went on and engaged their own testing group to run a qualitative evaluation, and they brought in 15 Australian Youth Allowance recipients and ran them through a previous version of the system, which is very similar to the one I've just showed you here. And they had lots of comments, lots of negative comments about the tailoring and suggestions for changes, which was all very helpful. But probably the two most important things that we discovered was that there was unanimity on 2 points. One, that they liked the idea of tailoring. They really do hate reading through the 2 to 3 page explanation of the eligibility conditions when all the system really needed to know was that you were a 21-year-old Australian Aboriginal studying at university. Why did they need to read 3 pages? They were very pleased with that, and indeed they were happy to answer as many wizard questions as we deemed necessary to produce that tailored text. We need to verify that more with a better quantitative study, but at least we have some marching orders, I think, from the Youth Allowance students in that study. But we will continue on with that. And secondly, as I've alluded to a couple of times, we really are keen to produce an author's interface that our colleagues or our collaborators at Centrelink could actually use. We worked mostly with authors and business analysts. They were not software engineers or knowledge engineers of any form. We also there did some simple qualitative studies to see if they could understand sort of the hierarchy of the concepts and the nature of the text blocks rather than sections and paragraphs and pages. And they seem to be working reasonably well with that, but of course that remains to be seen as well. I think with that, I will conclude. I will thank you for your attention, and I guess we open the floor for questions.
Time for quite a few questions. The speaker must be a good speaker.
Oh, well, thank you.
Right, any more? Any questions? I have one then, which is what you're really doing is that you've been looking at building the front end of the content creation, content selection.
Mm-hmm.
And have you had any thoughts about where the presentational part may or may not come into it, whether you need to do anything in terms of taking presentational form into account, or would it be helpful choosing to do one thing or another? For example, putting things together in one page, separating on pages, for example.
Yeah, so you're talking about layout, tailoring, and so forth. Yeah, we're very interested in that topic. We're not as advanced as this community in that. I've taken most of the prototypes we've built are taken largely from your own work. So I don't have a lot of interest to say that, except to say that we do agree that it's important and that we have partially built our mechanism so that we can continue that sort of work in the future.
So I really like this idea of formalizing legal notation.
Right.
Have you looked at, or have you had much thought about how you could go further with the legal system in general? Perhaps encoding all law as a set of logical constructs and then constructing the law from that?
Well, that's an exercise we leave to the reader. No, and in fact, I don't like our chances there. I mean, I don't want to say that we'll never try, but you've looked at legal text, right? We've all looked at legal text. Part of the reason that we've succeeded with Centrelink with this is that the informational brochures are at a higher level. They are not even an accurate representation of the real Centrelink rules. The real Centrelink rules are in the Centrelink policy manual, which maybe none of even the Australians have not seen. Promise you, it's more complicated than what I've shown here. What I've shown here is what the authors felt was the most important things. I think we can succeed at that level. I don't know if I like our chances, even with the policy manual, because things get really ugly really fast. So we will take it as far as we can, I promise you that. But I doubt whether we get all the way through the U.S. legal system. Yeah.
If you want to look at that one, Kowalski of 1981 was an attempt to systematically represent the British Nationality Act in prologue. And it could do certain things, and other things it just gave up because, well, the legal system has already got certain amounts of ambiguity inside anyway. But there was a very strong attempt to try that 30 years ago. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.